On this episode, we're going to take a look at my Handwired JTM45 and the mods that I did to it and all that jazz. What we'll do is I'll go over the amp, kind of a little short story time, go through the mods that I did to the amp itself. We'll play around on it, get some tones, the usual way we do, just wing some riffs out and put a mic in front of the cab and then put that on the video. It's a really cool amp. It's my favorite amp of all time, probably because I made it. It is a kit. It is hand wired. It is point to point. So I'll give you the backstory to this amp. We'll go through the features based on the mods that I did to it. We'll play on it for a bit, then we'll crack it open. I'll show you the guts, and I don't know, maybe it'll be fun to kind of see inside one of these things, and let's try that. So JTM45. This amp was a kit, the British 45 kit from Mojotone. The time I got this was sort of around the same time I started making pickups, a little bit after I started making pickups. And I wanted an amp that I could A/B pickups with, test new specs and stuff, and also capture sound clips, compare recorded stuff. But I wanted a real deal amp, and since the Canadian dollar was on par with the US dollar at the time, it's not anymore, but it was at the time, it made sense to get a kit, make it, and go that route than to find something like a JTM45 reissue or an old one or something like it. It was a lot more expensive to buy any of those than it was to just get this kit. So I went the cheapest route. I got the chassis and all the components, minus the cabinet and the tubes. And so I got that in, and I sourced the tubes here in Canada. And I made my own head cab, which is no longer in use. It's, the Tolex just started peeling and stuff. So I mentioned in a previous video, and I think I showed a picture. Maybe I'll pop one over here. So anyways, that's what the head cab I made. I literally went to Home Depot, got some hobby boards, built the head chassis, or the head cab, and had a plexiglass thing made with my design on it for a window in the front, just for branding. And it served its purpose for 5-6 years, maybe like 7 years, but it started to show its lack of proper construction. So I ditched that, and a couple of years back I got the head cab that you saw here, made by a guy here in Ontario, Derek Bell, Veteran Cabs. So as far as I understand it, Veteran Cabs, he builds cabs for a few amp builders here in Canada, and I think maybe the US. I might be wrong, but he builds good stuff, and it's all to spec. So this came up for the JTM45 chassis, and so I bought it and I put it in here. Now it looks like a legit amp, right? So when I got this, and I wired it up, I learned a lot about the circuit, and I looked into similar circuits. So basically, the JTM45, the Blues Breaker amps, like the first Marshall amps, and from that circuit evolved into like the super lead, like the Plexi amps, super lead, super bass, the JMP, which eventually became the JCM800, like the 2203 circuit, are all kind of an evolution of basically what's in here. So when I made the amp, I need to preface this with, I am not an amp tech. I'm not an amp designer, and I am not an electrical engineer or technician or anything like that. So don't take any of what I'm saying as a how-to, or you should do this to your amp, right? This is more for educational, or not even, it's more for entertainment purposes than anything. Kind of going over the stuff I did to this, which, probably shouldn't have, because I probably escaped death a few times, maybe, without even knowing. So when I first wired it up, and I had never turned it on yet, I wasn't sure how it was going to go. And I was worried because there is a lot of voltage going through these things. So when I was ready to test it, I got my wife to come downstairs, put on rubber boots, and hold a 2x4, a plank, like a piece of wood. And I said, I'm going to turn this on, and if I start shaking or anything, if I'm getting an electric shock, push me off of it with this 2x4. Now, luckily, that wasn't necessary, and everything was fine. So then she was able to go back upstairs. But then it ran. And so the first thing that I noticed was that it sounded really good, but there was a lot of low end. A lot of low end. I'll get to that later. But there's like almost too much low end. And it was loud, right? No master volume. And to get any gain out of it, you either had to use a distortion pedal and get all the gain from a pedal, and then it would sound like a pedal distortion and not amp distortion. And if you cranked it up to get that nice distortion, even with the bass rolled all the way off, it was farty and way too loud. So I started looking into the circuit after that to see like what are some mods I can do. The first thing was, and I'll get back to that once we look in the guts. I'll show you it. But the two coupling caps for what's called the phase inverter. So they were stock 0.1 microfarad, both of them. And so I read on, you go online, you could find all sorts of information. And I learned that the Plexis and the JCM, like the early 800s, had 0.022 microfarad coupling caps for the phase inverter. And what that would do is tighten up the low end and take out some low end, tighten up the amp. So what I did was I found some these were 0.027 microfarad. They were odd ball ones, but they were vintage spec. So I put those in, and that tightened up the low end, and then the amp was starting to sound real good, but still really loud. It is a vintage circuit, so in all intents and purposes, it's a vintage amp. So it's going to act like a vintage Marshall, where they need to be turned up to really sound full. And when you turn them down, they start to thin out and stuff. So the next thing was, okay, well, I need to put a master volume on here. So I tried a few master volumes, and I settled on one, which pretty sure is the pre-phase inverter one, where I think that the post-phase inverter one at lower volume, it just thinned out more than the pre-phase inverter one. Pretty sure that's how that went. So I found a master volume circuit that worked, that wasn't too bad. Now it's still a vintage amp in its circuit, so the master volume at my bedroom level, like I can get my bedroom level comfortably, maybe a touch louder than my comfortable vintage level, room level. It's a touch loud compared to the other amps I use at my bedroom level. So I don't play this one very often unless I'm the only one in the house. But it's still doable. And at that point, I was able to boost those two channel volumes and really get into the amp's natural gain, natural distortion at a much more reasonable volume, because it is 45 watts based on the Mojotone specs and all that. I know they can vary from 30 watts to 45 watts. This one's 45 watts, and it's a loud vintage Marshall 45 watts. So it pumps. So the master volume was great. So that was the second mod I did to this. And then I was good for a while. And then I started playing with pedals, and I wanted to play with reverb and delay, but it muddied up the amp running through the front. So I got the Mojotone drop-in effects loop kit. And that worked awesome. And then I was able to play like that for years. Little did I know, down the road, a problem would be revealed. But before that happened, I started reading, like studying the circuits for the JTM45, the Super Lead, the Super Bass, the JMP, which is sort of, I think, kind of all the same. JCM800, which 2203. So, and I believe they call some of the later JMPs the 2203 circuit as well. So I'm not too freshened up on fine details of all that, but very similar circuits. But you can see where they would change and improve or need to make a change in order to have a 100-watt head instead of 45 or 30 watts or whatever. But also the other thing too is people were starting to demand more gain from the amp. They wanted more distortion, so they were messing with that to get that. The other thing I learned about was and I'll kind of point that in when we look at the gut shot, the JTM 45 tone stack circuit, which is a series of capacitors and resistors in a cluster, was slightly different values than the Super Lead, Super Bass 800 by a good amount. So I looked into what they did, and it seemed to kind of reshape the mids. So got to realize the JTM 45 is Marshall's take on the Fender Bassman. And the reason it sounded a bit different is they were using British components as opposed to American components. And so instead of 6L6 tubes, they went to EL34. And I think there's a few other tubes too that they went through, but it's what was available in the UK at the time to try and make what they as close as to a Bassman as they could, sort of. And it ended up, blowing up Marshall into its own amp thing, right? Because if you compare a Bassman to a JTM, they're similar, but they're not the same amp still. So being kind of based on a Fender circuit originally, I didn't realize this, but a little bit more mid-scooped than later on with the Super Lead, the Plexis and all that. So then I put a switch, and I put a switch so that in the middle, it's the stock JTM Tone Stack, basically a tone stack switch. I'm not reinventing the wheel here. These are all things that amp, like Bogner, Friedman, you name it, Marshall even, are doing. Like a mid shift, like the Bogner Shiva here has a mid shift, essentially does what this is doing, basically. Scoops out mids and the overall volume drops a little bit, so you have to compensate a bit with the master volume. And I believe, no, the Ecstasy doesn't have a mid switch, but it's got some different switches that changes the low end and the high end and that kind of stuff. So kind of the same idea. So I put a 3-way switch. So what we have here, so if you look, this switch here goes up and down. Middle is stock JTM. And then when I go up, it goes to the Plexi, Super Lead, Super Bass type thing. And when you go down, it sounds very similar. I just changed the values just a bit to see if I can get like kind of a midway point. It sort of just shifts the low end and the low mids ever so slightly. It's barely noticeable. So it's basically a 2-setting switch technically by ear, but there's 3 sets of tone stack components that you're switching through. So that was the last mod I did before this thing had a failure. So what happened was it just stopped working. Things were all going amiss. And I tried swapping tubes, and tubes weren't like preamp tubes, and that wasn't the issue. I think there was an issue with one of the tube sockets loosening up, and the amount of power, like the amount of volume, wasn't the same. So I took it to an amp tech here in town, Mike Bonnell, Vintage Tone Wheels. Awesome guy, awesome tech, and he went through the whole amp. He went easy on me. He said, "Oh, the soldering work was pretty good, and everything looked fine. There's a few little things that he fixed that were like, I fixed this and that, but there was two major issues. So when I built this amp and I wired it point to point, I had the diagram, and I would go through every connection, and then I marked the connection with a black marker, because there's a lot of connections there that I'm not really sure what it does or what it's for. So I want to make sure that I got everything right based on the diagram, the schematic to a certain point, but I'm not an electrical technician or anything like that. So schematics don't make sense to me, but a point-to-point diagram, a picture of where the wire goes from where A to B, that made sense. So I cross out each single one. And then when I was all done, before I sparked it up, I checked every connection again and marked it with a gold marker. Turns out the one connection that I do understand was the ground wire from the 3-prong receptacle for a cable. I missed that one, and it's the one that I understand. So it's because I knew that connection so well, I was completely oblivious and blind to it because I was so worried about all the other ones. So that was one of the issues, and he said you could have probably shocked yourself pretty bad there and died if, you know, the wrong circumstance. So he fixed that, which is funny to me. It wasn't funny to him because he said you could have died, but to me it was funny because it's a connection I understand, right? It's not foreign to me. A ground is important, especially on a plug, but I completely overlooked it. The other problem was when he did the biasing, it was biased so hot, he said, that it was pretty much Chernobyl in there every time you turn it on. And so that made a lot of sense with how, in its stock form, how low-endy it was and how it wasn't very bright of an amp. But when you pushed it, it just sounded so good. So when I got it back, everything was good. Everything was like, everything checked out. But there was an issue with, there was no low end. It was bright and thin. And so, I lost my amp. My sound was just... So then began the quest to try and get it back to sort of how it was without having the bias altered to where it should be, where it was. So the coupling caps on the phase inverter from 0.022s, I bumped them up to 0.047. That fattened up the low end a bit. And I might actually go back to the stock ones, the 0.1 microfarad coupling caps on the phase inverter, just to get the low end to where it's technically supposed to be when it's biased right. So I might get that tone back without cooking the bias. There's a few other things too that bothered me. And the effects loop, the Mojotone effects loop eventually failed. Probably got cooked by how much voltage was going through this whole thing. So I put in a Granger effects loop, and it ended up being better. And when you turn it off, it actually bypasses the whole circuit, it sounds like, because you turn it off and it goes straight out to the master volume, then out to the power section. But then I started reading more and more, and I learned about the bright cap. And there's a bright cap mod you can do with a switch. So that's what I did. So on this side, in the middle, it's no bright cap. And then on this side, it's the stock bright cap I originally wired into this amp. And then on the other side, it's so the stock one's I can't remember if it's a 250 picofarad or 500 picofarad. I think it's actually might be 280. We'll say 250, whatever. It doesn't matter. The stock one. And the other one is a 4700 picofarad, which is what the Super Leads, Super Bass, JCM 800, 2203 have. Actually, maybe not the 800. I don't know if it has a bright cap or not. The other, so the Plexi, Super Lead, Super Bass with the 4 inputs, all the 4 input ones, and the 2 channel volumes. Those amps have, so it has that bright cap. So I'm able to switch. And what I noticed is that on the 4700, so we'll call it Plexi mode or Super Lead mode, you get a bit more brightness, a bit more of everything, a little bit more volume, and in turn it gives more amp gain, more distortion. So I kind of get 3 amps in one that way. So this isn't sacrilegious for modding this amp because it's not a vintage one, but it is based on the vintage circuit. So that's the amp in a nutshell. I always jumper the channels. I never play one or the other because I find that I never like either of them, but when I jumper them, I like them both. And then you can do the age-old trick of you set the EQ pretty well flat, and then you can EQ the amp with the volume, right? You want more brightness, turn the bright volume up. If you want more low end, you turn up the normal one, and you can fine tune it that way. And then if you want to run it like stock, I have it wired so that you crank the master volume all the way and it's essentially out of the circuit. And so then you've got the normal super loud JTM amp. So try to think if there's anything else I've done to this. I'll show you the back end, and then we'll plug it in, we'll play it, and then we'll look at the guts, and then we'll sign off for the weekend. But So there's the fuses, there's the speaker 4/8/16 speaker outs. So there's my master volume right here, which is kind of sort of like it's after the effects loop. So it's kind of like a return, but not really. And there's the effects loop with an on-off switch there. Yeah, it's a cool amp. The process of making your own amp is pretty rewarding. It's pretty awesome. But if you're not well versed with soldering and all that stuff, I wouldn't recommend it necessarily, because you can make a mess of it real quick and ruin a lot of parts. But if you know how to solder and you're good with that, a kit's a pretty cool way to go. But I would before you turn it on, I would take it to an amp tech to have them check everything and have them turn it on in a safe environment so that you don't get cooked. Because it is a lot of voltage, and if you don't know what you're doing, you can get hurt real bad real quick. So it is a vintage amp essentially, so it does need to be pushed loud to get the proper sound. We're gonna mic it up the way we usually do with a 57. I'm gonna back it off the cabinet a little bit to maybe see if we can get more of the room sound. And we'll go through some tones, and then we'll check the guts, and then sign off. Yeah, hopefully you like this. Oh, before we look at the guts, when I first wired it all up, it was so clean, and all the wires, like, it just looked so pro. You know, everything lined up and bent, and the more I'd go in and do mods or repairs, whatever, it just got messy. So it's pretty bird nesty now. Just have, keep that in mind, and I'm not an amp designer and amp tech, so that's to be expected. I'm gonna wire everything, mic everything up, fire up the amp, and then we'll wing out some tunes and just come up with whatever. All right, just to go over the board real quick too that we'll be using for the amp. This is what we're plugged into. This is doing nothing right now. That's the channel switcher for the Shiva, so that's not even in the equation. The signal path here goes from tuner to the soul food, to the plumes, and then the ODR1 to the front of the amp. And then in the loop, we have the chorus, dispatch, master, starlight, flint, back to the return. Basically what I do is I push these are set with low, the drive or the overdrive is set low and the volume is set high. So basically I'm cleanish boosting the front end of the amp, and I'm doubling up with 2 there. I'll either do that or I'll do this just for a different type of tone. And then everything else in the loop. And we'll try it with the loop off and stuff too. But this is essentially especially this piece, this pair here is how I'm pushing more into the amp to get more gain out of the amp. So it's essentially more amp gain than like amp distortion than pedal distortion. If I run the master volume all the way up on the JTM and the channel volume's lower, it's a very clean amp. And if I put these in, it's not going to distort the amp. It's just going to boost the overall volume of the amp even more. So when you turn the amp all the way up and then the master down to tame it, pushing these gets it into gain because it caps out on volume. So that's how I'm manipulating the amp to get what I need. And yeah, so mic it up and here we go. JTM45, we're in a huge 212 cab. I think it used to be an old Trainer bass cab. I bought it gutted, re-Tolexed it for this amp and put 2 12-inch speakers. There's a vintage 30 on the bottom left, and we're mic'd on the Creamback 65 on the top right. The mic's kind of backed off a little bit to get some of the room a bit in there. I think I got it sounding decent, so we'll take it. First set, so everything's kind of set middle. Well, not really. The presence is on at like 9 o'clock, just so it's just barely doing anything. The bass is on max because I think I'm gonna have to go up on the phase inverter coupling caps to 0.1 microfarad, as I mentioned earlier. The mids are on 4, trebles on 5, so that's pretty standard there. I'm in the Plexi Tone Stack, so the up position, so more mids. And currently in the Actually, no, let's do this. I'm going to turn it to the JTM Tone Stack. We'll go through the 3 bright caps, then we'll go up into the mids. I find the Plexi mode tone stack fills out the mids and it sounds better. So we'll finish off with that, but we'll do a little test with the JTM. So basically just put it in the middle. You'll hear the mids drop a little bit and you'll hear the mids fill up when we bump it up. But for now, this is no bright cap, JTM Tone Stack. The volumes are at about 6, master volumes at about 10 o'clock. So my room volume. So probably louder than most people's room volume, but that's my room volume. A little bit of grit, right? Got a bit of flint in the effects loop. Here, let's turn the effects loop off so you could hear the difference. So everything in the effects loop is off except the effects loop is on. I'll turn the effects loop off. Okay, so the effects loop is essentially out of the circuit. Right? Not too much of a change, so I like to leave it on and have a bit of reverb because it sounds nice. Now, can you get a clean out of it? Yeah, you can crank the master volume and put the volume, like the channel volumes down a bit. But I think this is pretty good, and you can roll the volume back on the guitar. I'm going to put the bright cap onto the stock JTM bright cap. So you'll notice it gets a little bit brighter. Sometimes some of the best cleans have just a little bit of grit in there, you know? Put the bright cap on the super lead bright cap. Notice there'll be a volume jump and a little bit more grit, more gain. A little bit more in your face, you get more of that Kerrang kind of thing. No overdrives are on right now. This is just essentially straight into the amp. Now I'm going to turn on the Plexi Tone Stack and put it back to the no bright cap. Okay, so here's that. See, it fills out the mids. There's low mids and more girth. JTM bright cap. gets a little bit dirtier that way. Let's go to the super lead bright cap. Now you're getting that Marshall sound there. The mids. Now let's turn the reverb off, and I'll push it with the soul food. So that's with the Plexi bright cap. Throw a soul food on. And then you could stack that with the plumes as well, so you're boosting it double, essentially. Gets noisier. That's a lot of gain. I don't know why you need more than that, really. But just a great rock tone. I'm gonna go back to the JTM bright cap and push it with all the overdrive. So you'll notice it'll sound more vintagey with that. So this is without any overdrive. With the soul food. Let's throw the plumes on too. Man, that sounds good. I don't know what's going to sound like through the computer or through the video, but that's the sound that I'm at home with. We've covered pretty much everything. I mean, it's a single channel amp with a few little switches and mods. Nothing major there. Here's what it sounds like with an ODR1. That's with it off. Maybe a tad much with an ODR1 and chorus and all that. Other thing I could think of, the last thing to think of for sounds is just to show the pristine clean you can get out of this by cranking the master volume and then adjusting the two channel volumes. So let's do that. Then we'll close it off. We'll pop the thing out of the box and look at the guts, and then it'll be time to crack a beer and have a weekend. All right. So for clean, roll the two volumes down. We're going to stay on the JTM bright cap. cranking the master volume all the way up. Try not to redline my meters here. So here's a good way. Here, let me just grab the camera, pull it over. Okay, so here's a good way to show how you can EQ these amps by just using the channel volumes, right? So let's say that's loud and that's a little bright. Right, that's probably clipping meters. Bit. So you want a bit more low end, you turn up the normal channel. See how it darkens it up, so you got to find the balance. Throw some reverb on there. Bit of starlight. I'm winging whatever I'm playing, so it's bound to be full of mistakes, but this is where I find this amp doesn't quite do it, is when you do clean with an ODR1. Just doesn't quite do it. So I prefer the natural distortion from the amp. So I don't know, man. Let's shut her down, crack it open. We'll look at the guts real quick, and then that'll be that. So hopefully it sounds good through the video, because it sounds awesome in the room. Just realized I didn't play a Strat through here, and so this is gonna be a long son of a gun. Not a whole lot of Strat playing, because I'm not really big on, I'm not a big Strat player, so just a quick riff just to kind of show how different guitars do sound different through the amp. Told you I'm not really a Strat player. That's no overdrive on. Let's kick on an overdrive, see what we get there. That's a Strat through a JTM45. Let's open the guts up. Here we are inside my amp. This is inside the JTM45. Used to be a lot cleaner and nicer in here, but over time it just becomes rat nesty. And but I'm okay with that. Just to kind of go over the areas that I modded in order to get to where it's at. The first thing, remember I mentioned the coupling caps and the phase inverter. So right here is the phase inverter section. And these two capacitors here are the ones that you'd want to change if you want more or less bass. So stock JTM has 0.1 microfarad coupling cap. So this one and this one, they run parallel here. Right now I've got 0.047 microfarads in here. So if I go up to 0.1, I'll get more bass. If I go to 0.022s, I'll have less bass. It'll be tighter. But the way that this is set up, when it was biased super hot, I had a lot of low end, so I had to lower these to kind of tame that. Now that it's biased correctly, I got to move these back up to get that low end. So I think I'm going to go to probably 0.1s again and try that to get a bit, because right now I'm running the bass on max and I'm getting the bass where I want it. So I figure if I go with 0.1 on these, I'll be able to run the bass at about 5 and it'll be sort of at the magic spot right in the midway point. So it gives you way to turn it up more if you want or down, that kind of thing. So that was one of the mods. Obviously over here, you can see he's got the Granger board here. This is the effects loop module. That's wired in. You can see where the wires go. These go to the treble pot because after the treble, it normally goes to the phase inverter, I believe. So what I've done here is it goes to this section and then back into the power section. Right? This is after the phase inverter, I think. Is it? I have no idea. I'm not an amp tech. Whatever. I hooked it up the way they told me to hook it up, and that's the way it's hooked up. Here's your master volume back here. Just a standard 1 meg pot, or I think in this case I have a 500K pot, and that's grounded here, and then that ties into after the effects loop. So that's what we got here. Now the other two mods that I talked about are the tone stack switch, which is down in here where I'm pointing with the pencil. So it's hard to see, but there's basically a resistor and a capacitor, and each mode has different capacitor and resistor to get those different mid-voicing points. So that's that switch. And then the bright cap. So the bright cap used to be on the bright channel volume pot, and it used to go right across here. And essentially what I've done is bypass that. I don't put a cap there. I run two wires, one from each lug goes to a switch, and then the switch switches between no cap, and then the stock cap, and then the super lead cap, which is what we got over here. Those are the mods I did. Everything else is pretty much exactly to the diagram that I got from Mojotone back in 2014. So you got 1, 2, 3 preamp tubes here, then you got your power tubes, and then you got the tube rectifier, which is tube rectifier is a GZ34S from JJ. The power tubes I actually run in here are Electro Harmonix 6CA7s. I used to have EL34s in this, which I really liked, but then it fried, and I wanted to try something a little bit different. And I read that the 6CA7s are kind of in between an EL34 and a 6L6. So I figured, kind of get best of both worlds by going that route. If I were to ever replace the power tubes and have it rebiased again, I would probably go back to EL34s, just because when it had EL34s, I really liked it. So I want to see if maybe some of what's missing is out of that. But right now, the way that the amp is running and sounding is right. I'm comfortable with that. It sounds really good. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Like, that's point to point. Everything is a separate component. There is no PCB except for the effects loop. Any of this stuff here or these guys, like, you don't want to touch that. There's probably still voltage in here. I didn't drain the voltage because I'm not doing any work. I just want to show what a JTM45 hand-wired looks like. At least a kit. This is the one that I did. Really rewarding experience making your own amp, wiring it point to point from scratch, and you really get to know what makes what tick, right? Another mod here, right here. This brown guy is supposed to be a 0.022 microfarad capacitor, just like this one. This one runs to the mid pot down this way. This one runs to the treble and then piggybacks onto the bass. So by going up in value here, you're tweaking the low end a little bit more low end, as far as I've been able to read. So this isn't too far off. It's instead of a 0.022, it's a 0.039 there, and it just kind of changes the low end a little bit, which I find helps at lower volume. That's essentially what I'm trying to do there. But at the same time, you know, I'm not an amp guy. I'm not an amp tech or amp designer. So I'm sure if an amp designer was watching this video, which I doubt, they'd probably have a few other things to say. But that is the amp we played through today. It's pretty cool, man. It's pretty cool. It's a thing of beauty. They don't make them like this anymore. All right, so sorry about the long one this time. I'm going to try and cut it down as much as I can. But I don't know. Hopefully you got something out of this, or maybe you got an idea of how you'd want an amp tech to mod your amp, or maybe you're like me and you're a tinkerer and you're good at soldering and stuff, and you got some understanding of how an amp works, and you want to try a kit. Do it, but don't take anything of what I said as the how-to. This is not a how-to. This is just purely what I did at my own risk. So if you proceed beyond this, you're at your own risk. Unless you really know what you're doing, then have at her. Very rewarding to make your own amp. The old JTM45 circuit is awesome. As you heard, you can get plenty of gain tones out of that too. And you can get really pristine cleans. It really is one of the best amps ever, and definitely one of my favorites, if not my favorite. I am partial because I wired it up, but it's pretty awesome. And at a time, it was cheaper to go that route. It still kind of is, but you're gonna spend a heck of a lot more money, and then with the tariffs, who knows what kind of shit you're gonna have to pay on top of everything, depending on where you're at. If you're in the States, you don't have to worry. So yeah, have a good weekend. Have a great week. We'll be back at her hopefully next week with something else. But that was the JTM45. I've been Jas. This has been the 59er Winder Show, where we turn the cameras on and wing it every week. And yeah, I'll put some links down for any of the pickups in the guitars that we're using, the Strat and the Les Paul. I'm sorry I don't really play a lot of Strat. I really should just put some effort into learning more Strat stuff. I just tend to lean more towards the Les Pauls, even though I love the way a Strat sounds, or a Tele or whatever. I can never really make it, like, do it justice. But something to work on. Find something to work on, and we'll see you next week. Here's an amp secret. All the best amps seem to have big iron, huge transformers. This amp doesn't fuck around.